Am I moving these? We are ready to go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session on the 10 must-haves. My name is Peter Schlosser. I'm Vice President and Vice Provost of Arizona State University and the Director of the Julie and Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, and I will lead through this session. Just to set the context, what are the 10 must-haves, must-dos, and how-to-dos? If we are looking at our world and the pressures that we have created onto the life supporting systems on which we all depend, we have to realize that we made quite a few efforts to define what does it need to stay within boundaries that allow a future in which coming generations have still choices rather than just dealing with problems we leave for them. And initiatives such as the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the Paris Accord, have actually set targets that we should move towards and that we should meet in order to keep the world on a reasonable track. Sadly, we also have to recognize that in virtually all the cases, we are off the targets. Our trajectories are not close enough to them. That led to discussions within the Earth League to say, what can we actually do about that situation? How can we think about ways that would lead to faster trajectories, different trajectories, more nimble ways to move off the present trajectory to pathways that bring us more closely to the targets that we all have signed on to? And that really was the beginning of the initiative that we call must-haves. What we will discuss today is mainly from the results of two so-called Global Futures conferences called GF22 in 22 and this year GF23 that were convened during Climate Week in New York. And during the first one, we defined which areas do we think are the most important to tackle to get action towards the targets that we think we have to reach to keep the world on track. This year, we used them as a starting point, but then spent most of the time during the conference discussing what do we actually have to do to reach these must-haves. And we already started to get somewhat into topic of how would we actually have to approach these must-dos, what we called how-to-dos. So, and that is mainly what we will talk about here today. Just a sense of where this initiative will go. We have, we had during the past 2 years an increasing number of partners who signed on to that initiative. And we envision that we will actually form, moving forward, an alliance or a coalition of these partners and others who sign on to that initiative so that we actually can create almost like a movement that is complementary, not substitution to what is already out there, but is not immediately pressured into political frameworks or into other procedures and processes that might hinder the intellectual space that we have to occupy, and thereby also then create the capacity to be faster in getting results shared among those who are needed to engage in moving forward. So that's the framework for the 10 must-haves. You will see in a moment how we are going through the agenda today. So we have a presentation of the 10 must-haves by Johan, and then we have a distinguished panel members of the panel will address the audience here with their opening thoughts on specific elements of the 10 must-haves. And then we will go into a discussion, and the discussion will be a conversation that I will moderate, and then we will have the time for questions and answers. So with that, I would like to ask Johan to, Johan, I will actually bring them up for you here, to briefly introduce the 10 must-haves. You can actually come over here to the podium. I will leave that space, and then we will go into the, I think you don't need that. I probably have to make sure that I get out of here without getting.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And um, my suggestion is not to walk through all the 10, just to mention briefly 3 of them that are particularly relevant for COP28, but just to kind of add further, let's say, scientific justification for the whole 10 must have to what Peter just introduced here. Um, as Peter pointed out, and I think we're all agreeing that we're coming into a zone of danger when it comes to the risks related to our inability to act not only on climate change, but on the whole planetary stability. And when you look at empirical evidence over the history of humankind and how we deal with crisis situations, we have a lot of scientific support that the difference between whether you're in a crisis, continue to just dig yourself deeper, deeper down in the hole and get stuck in an unwanted trajectory versus the ability to transition into a new pathway to solve the problem is whether you have a plan. You need to have agency, knowledge, and prepare the society, the capacities to be able to pick the plan off the shelf the day you wake up in the morning and say, "Oh my God, we've pushed this too far." That's very likely why we were able to solve the COVID-19 pandemic. There had been 20 years of science to bring ourselves to the capacity to accelerate COVID vaccine. We had the World Health Organization ready to put very, very hard global governance measures that could basically shut down unhealthy, risky behavior. We had very good preparedness in society. We don't have that on sustainability. We don't have it on climate. We're still operating according to this negative theory of resilience that if you're stuck in a hole, rule number 1 is stop digging. But we continue digging while we need to have a plan to move ourselves out of the hole. The 10 must haves is the first attempt in the world to design that plan. You could call it a plan B. You could call it a plan to prepare yourself for transformation. It's a way out of the impasse. So that's the idea. And that's why we did something with the Global Futures Conference, which is also unique, which is to really invite stakeholders from academia, from policy, from civil society, from industry, so many walks of life to really brainstorm what are the 10 top priority plans we need to be able to move out of that hole when we understand that now that enough is enough and we really need to accelerate and scale. So the list of 10 is that attempt. And if you look at the document and check through what we're suggesting, of course you'll find um, you know, the accelerated transition towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius future. So basically solving the climate crisis from an energy transition perspective. It has a food transition, which is equally important to have a chance of a safe operating space within planetary boundaries. It's addressing in a very heads-on way what we need to do in economics. What are the big ideas out there that have a lot of scientific evidence behind them to move faster towards a circular economy, to get true cost accounting, to have inclusive welfare, equitable economic transitions. And I just want to give you a few examples of why we think that the must-do list is so important, and that we add to that list what many times in the corridors are rejected as being fantasies. But in reality, we conclude that nothing less than these kind of measures must be part of a must-have plan. So one of them is, of course, on the 1.5 degrees Celsius position, is to once and for all agree we need a global price on carbon. And that has been scientifically inquired for over 20 years. We even know the numbers. We have to start at 100 US dollars. We have to have it move towards 200, even 300 US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. Many times it's perceived as being completely impossible. But when you look at the assessment, over 40 countries in the world have prices on carbon. The European Union, the largest economic region in the world, is now introducing the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which in fact will be imposing a carbon price on those who want to import goods and services to Europe, because otherwise you'll pay to Brussels instead of having the money staying in Beijing. This is quite interesting. We are probably at a pivotal point here. I just want to share with you a story I had just a few days back with the CEO of the world's largest provider of engine technologies for commercial shipping. He said, give us 300 US dollars in price of carbon, and we will, in 5 years' time, decarbonize commercial shipping in the world. 5 years, 300 US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. And then he said, will the economy collapse on that? I mean, we're talking about all the containers in the world. We're talking about the global trading system. He said, during the pandemic, every container price increased by 1,000%. Did the global economy collapse? Did we as consumers find ourselves on the streets as some kind of gilets jaunes uprising? No. We simply incorporated this in the economy. We could barely sense a change. So, we're not talking utopia here. We're talking of plans that are outside of the conventional, yes. They're not in the incremental mainstream, they're in the transformative pathways, but they're certainly not fantasies. And that is what we're trying to do here, that the must-do plans must be things that are scalable, that can be accelerated, but ideas that we've been testing and working with for a long, long time. So it won't come as a surprise that on the food system transition, the Eat Lancet Commission has been working since 2019 on the planetary health diet, and that we can scale healthy and sustainable diets for a transition that can accelerate the pathway that can have win-win outcomes to reduce the premature death of 10 million people per year from unhealthy food, but also bring us back within planetary boundaries. So we're quite excited about this, but we need help to concretize and perfect this even further. So I think with that, handing back to you, then Peter, and then again, check the 10 in the document. Thanks.
Thank you, Johan. I hope this gave you a good sense of what we are dealing with, and we will now dive into some of them in more detail. And let me just call up the one that we will start with. So we have on the panel Alex Dehgan, often known as Alex Dehgan. So took me a while to figure out what the real pronunciation is. Um, and I will leave it up to the panelists to do a short introduction of themselves because we don't want to read lengthy bios. Johan already was on the podium. We have Jemilah Mahmood here and Maja Groff. We will start with Alex, who will talk a bit about, or will share his thoughts about the must-have that is on the immediate halt and reversal of the loss of nature's function and diversity. Alex.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex Dehgan. Dehgan. I get used to actually mispronouncing my own name, but I'm CEO of an organization called Conservation X Labs, and we innovate and build technology in companies to solve the sixth mass extinction. I'm also very proud to be a professor of the practice under Peter at Arizona State University and benefit from his extraordinary leadership there. I'm really happy about to talk about this must-have because I really think if we look at these 10 must-haves, they all depend on this one, right? And one of the things that we need to think about is nature is an extraordinary innovator, and we actually need to harness it to solve many of these challenges, right? So if you think about this dependence, many of our issues on climate, right, depending on functioning and diverse ecosystems, whether it's the carbon systems in our ocean with phytoplankton and marine snow, to thinking about the ecosystems in the rainforest and the roles that they play, to the nematodes that are within our souls. Our misuse of health and our misuse of exceeding planetary boundaries, right, has specifically caused the pandemic that we all suffered through. And this is, as you may have remembered yesterday, the first COP, where we've had a health ministerial, and health has been first and foremost within what we're doing. Environment, right? Misuse of environment undermines national security. We've been talking about this, right? It causes refugees, it destabilizes countries fundamentally. And sustainability is both a disruptive and an innovative force, right? That helps us allow economies to operate within safe and just boundaries, right? But when we provide subsidies for destruction, we're actually disrupting and hurting the goal of an ethical world that provides for human security, equity, and education. And biodiversity conservation allows for greater resilience. So I see it as underwriting so much of what we're talking about in the must-haves. Sustainability, right? One of the goals that we talk about is the importance of thinking about global investments in nature-based solutions that must triple by 2030. And for us to really be able to do that, we can recognize that sustainability is not just nice to have for companies and for our global economy, but is actually necessary for these companies to grow and succeed in the future. It is not ESG anymore. It is now core to the business strategies that we must have. And an example I gave yesterday was thinking about SpaceX, and the reason SpaceX is successful is because they're a circular economy company by reusing their rockets. That gives them an order of magnitude savings. And if you think about efficiencies that we can have, and you think about sustainability, right? If we look at UPS, they learned by actually increasing the efficiencies of their systems, they could generate far more profits. We need to think about this as a tool, and this is one of the ways that we get there. And it really leads to kind of yesterday I think Gavin McCormick, who was featured at the Global Futures Conference, spoke, and this trend of climate trace and involuntary transparency means that companies cannot hide any more than for what they're doing, right? They've outed 70 million point source emissions and put the names of the people associated with them available for people to find, right? That doesn't mean that we are to vilify those companies. Our goal is to give them the pathway to protect climate and to protect biodiversity. And I think that is really how we also get to here. Is for a long time, conservation has been around for 50 years, right? This year is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, of the Endangered Species Act. We had Earth Day 53 years ago. We had the field of conservation biology, the Society of Conservation Biology started 47 years ago. During this time, in many ways, what we have done is on a stream on the side of the Amazon. And the Amazon is the economy. And unless we think about how we transform that economy, we will not be successful. These companies need help, right? We need technologies. We need to integrate biodiversity science that we've had for 50 years, right? What have we done as scientists? I'm an extinction scientist. I'm literally the most depressing person to invite to dinner. I promise you, right? Because what do? We describe and mourn the passing of species and write up their epitaphs as scientific papers. That is what we do as scientists, and we can't do that. We have to use work that has gone into monitoring and actually help companies with monitoring, reporting, verification, and understanding their impact on nature. And this is one of the things that we're starting to see and transform. And the fact is, those companies can't recruit their future employees. They cannot get past their shareholders. They cannot be competitive in the landscape unless they're actually thinking about that. Um, Ultimately, I think what we need to do when we're thinking about how we reach this goal, because quite frankly, the problems are increasing exponentially, and our solutions have really been linear. Is think about how we increase the rate of innovation and increase the rate of solutions. And part of that is also helping people that are closest to the problem, that bear the greatest cost conservation efforts, solve those problems. And to do that is thinking, we work in the Amazon right now, and how do we change the equation for building economies not of the past, economies of the 1850s that are based on extraction, economies of the future that are based on regeneration. And that means we've got to beat the price of soy per hectare and beat the price of cattle farming per hectare, and create new pathways that are based on regeneration and new economies. And that's some of the work we're doing with support of Schmidt Futures and the Moore Foundation and others. Last thing I'm going to say is, when I was younger, I was the person that brought into my parents' household. They still don't quite understand me, but every insect, snake, or thing I would catch and go out there. And I remember we were driving on the highways. Our cars were covered with insect bodies, right? My windshields are clear now. And the fact is, we're on the precipice of a sixth mass extinction. Whole groups of species that we don't really monitor well have disappeared, and they're critical to the functioning of our ecosystems. See, I told you guys I'm depressing at dinner, right? But conservation was as a solutions-based discipline and crisis-based discipline, and it hasn't been that. And it's really clear that much as we have created these problems, we have the means to solve them. We have the means to create new economies of the future. We have the means to build new technologies. My company has supported 141 companies and innovations from 70 countries on 6 continents and helped them raise $300 million on the pathway to scale non-dilutively. We can do this, and nature has to be a critical part of this.
Thank you, Alex. You have to tell me where you are driving or how fast you are driving, because I still have that problem with the windshields. Uh, so, talking about we cannot hide anymore, I just see Andrew Solly here, and Planet, of course, was one of the co-conveners of GF23, showing that we are moving from academia also into the private sector, sort of broadening the tent under which we are working. And another small deviation from what we had choreographed, given that we had this statement by the president of COP23 about whether or not there is scientific evidence on the phase out or the need for the phase out. I just wanted to make sure that we are all cognizant of that debate that has been started by that statement, which in my view actually throws us back further than we had hoped we would. But clearly that was one of the surprises that people were wondering what would come up that has political content here. But this clearly was not anticipated in that kind of fundamental nature. So let's then move on to the governance one. And there it is. And Maja Groff, after introducing herself briefly, will give us her thoughts about global governance.
Thanks so much, Peter. Great to be here, everyone. And my name is Maja Groff. I lead the Climate Governance Commission, which now in high-level phase is co-chaired by Johan Rockström, Mary Robinson, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who was the 73rd president of the General Assembly, among other wonderful commissioners. So we've been doing this really hard work for the last couple of years on improvements in planetary climate, and now really taking a view of planetary boundary governance, because we feel this is an absolutely vital perspective. I agree, nature is absolutely vital. That's the whole point. But this governance lens is really sort of a meta lens also to enable all of these must-haves, must-dos. And I think this will become clearer and clearer as we go deeper into the planetary emergency. So in our investigations, we just released a new report, November 28th, governing our planetary emergency. Invite you all to read. But what we found in our explorations with policymakers, academics, climate advocates is that still we're from the national level looking up. We're still not taking the planetary level, looking at the whole of the planet. And this is our responsibility now in the Anthropocene. We have the power to govern properly, to govern effectively. And I'm an international lawyer by trade, and I know the potential in international law, international institutions. We have the capacity now, we have the maturity in our institutions, techniques, international law. We're simply not using them yet in terms of planetary climate governance, planetary boundary governance. So I think this is also a very positive story in terms of what we can uncover and advocate for on the governance level. And also, there's this misconception that like strong, more effective international governance means that it sort of, subdues the regional or the local, and that's absolutely doesn't have to be the case. Principles of subsidiarity, multi-level governance, where they're all connected in very dynamic ways, is very much part of our thinking and part of our contemporary thinking at this moment, generally in international governance. So in terms of the concrete proposals, you have some of these very admirable proposals in terms of the Global Futures process, which we indeed feature and really underline in the Climate Governance Commission report this year. One which we didn't talk about too much at Global Futures is COP reform, urgent COP reform. And Johan at the Potsdam Institute, together with Club of Rome and others, wrote a letter about how do we sharpen the climate COPs to make them focused on outcomes based on the science, accountability. And in the report, we introduce a new mechanism of just a step forward in terms of accountability under the Paris Agreement, which was proposed by a very talented lawyer in the Netherlands who helped to win the groundbreaking, path-breaking case to hold the Dutch government to account. And is also familiar with European scientific and other national climate councils that are science-based that advise policymakers. So our accountability suggestion is to have a council which can be independent, advising and publicly assessing whether countries are living up to their ambition, fair NDCs, which is indeed their obligations under the Paris Agreement. So there are these very sharp near-term suggestions. Also, as noted, an emergency platform. Our international system is currently fragmented. It's siloed. Biodiversity Convention, Desertification Convention, UNEP, UNEA, very still too weak. We need support across the whole of the international system to really, as Johan was saying, to come up with a plan. We need actually a planetary emergency plan to do rationally what we need to do to get done. And again, I have very, very strong hopes and optimism about what we can actually accomplish as an international community. I've worked in binding international treaty law negotiations and servicing these treaties for many years, and our capacity for cooperation is actually incredible, and it is there. We're also suggesting a declaration of a planetary emergency by the General Assembly. That is simply what the science is saying. And as we've seen at this COP, the understanding of the planetary science and then what the required actions is still very, very shaky across key policymakers, and that's around the world. Also, one of our proposals is an enhanced international scientific capacity. We have the IPCC, we have biodiversity, scientific panel body, but again, this is fragmentation. We're not looking at the whole of the planetary boundaries, how they're interacting. If we're going to govern climate, we have to look at other key planetary boundaries. So we're flying blind at the moment, which is really insane in terms of managing what risks are coming our way, what kind of disasters. And we're also recommending finally some international law improvements, upgrading ecological governance in the international system. Currently, you could look at the report, but I'll just mention lastly, which we didn't get in so much yet at Global Futures, is also the next generation international environmental governance. Back in 2009, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy wrote a letter proposing a global environment agency to defragment the international ecological governance. And scientists have been asking for this for decades. So this is something we have to work on in parallel to tightening the screws on our existing governance. And so lastly, to the point of how to do theories of change. And just again, from my vantage point as an international legal practitioner, it seems often very remote and distant, these international processes and institutions, but this is really not the case. Civil society coalitions, so-called smart coalitions working with like-minded governments have been incredibly successful in pushing through major international reforms. For example, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the upcoming advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice, small island states in particular with youth integrated that incredible process. governance. The Marshall Islands, a tiny state, was instrumental in helping to have the 1.5 degree limitations in the Paris Agreement, etc. And also, so we're building Mobilizing Earth Governance Alliance, which we hope to work closely with the Global Futures and ASU and all academics, policy think tanks, like-minded governments, of course, but also business is very important. Green lobby, we're talking to a lot of influential businesses, and really it's about developing a governance of excellence in this field upon which all life societies depend. And if we have the capacity, we can develop a governance of excellence. And this will open huge opportunities for our societies too, because there's these huge positive payoffs for getting our ecological governance in order. Thank you.
Thank you, Maja. And Maja made two very important points. One is we have the tendency to look at the issues that we are seeing globally in little bits and in pieces rather than holistically. Although we know that we are living on a planet where all the subsystems of the overall Earth systems are intricately connected. And the other one is the other point, Maja, that you made, I think is really important, is we are moving towards a disaster, but we are not prepared. We don't have disaster preparedness for scales of planetary nature. So let's move on then to human health and planetary health. Where did I skip that? Here we are. So we will hear the thoughts of Jemilah Mahmood on that after a short introduction.
Thank you very
much. Thank you very much, Peter. I am a physician. I'm a medically trained doctor. I work in Malaysia for many years, more than 20 years. I've worked in crisis, in disasters, in conflict, and health crisis as well. And right now, I have established about 2.5 years ago a planetary health center based at Sunway University in Malaysia. Now, why did I set this up? Is precisely because, first of all, Johan, really inspired by planetary boundaries discussion, but also the fact that we as health workers and health practitioners, we are clueless about what's going on with the rest of the world. And I think that I'm going to start from there to say that, here we are in COP talking about international action. We have a Global Health Day finally. And yet, the victories that are shouted out in headlines, like we are going to, reduce fossil fuels, is marred by announcements in media, as what was Peter was alluding to. And I think even in my own field of work, I sit on the global panel for a public health convention. We are stuck. We can't move on the pandemic treaty. There is no political will. The minute transparency and accountability is put into the language, everyone then just puts their hands up and steps away. And there's the lack of political will. It's so difficult, and it's always this price tag that people put on it. So what do we do? So I spent a year and a bit thinking about this, how do we move this? And I'm asking myself as a health practitioner, certainly when I was in Malaysia, I had so much influence because I talked to my patients. And why aren't people like me, health leaders, talking to the politicians and the leaders that they are treating? And it's because we have failed in our medical education to connect the dots between what is health and looking at it from a very narrow medical perspective, that it only accounts for 20% of health determinants. And we've not succeeded in bringing in environment and so forth. Just before walking in here, I met Dr. Muna, who's in the crowd, and she was telling me in the UK, trying to come to this COP28, I was told, no, you can go to any conference, but nothing on climate change. And it's the United Kingdom. The National Health Service would not recognize climate change as a health situation. So we have a lot to do, right? And we talk about cooperation and equity. We agree with each other what we needs to be done. We want transformative change. We need that, but it isn't really happening. And we all tapped at our politicians and in the private sector and so on and so forth. And then recently at a COP event here, I heard the president of our oil company, Petronas, saying that basically he says the law of economics apply. If there is demand, there will be supply. Pointing to the otherization. And I thought about this and I thought, well, there is some truth in that, in the sense that we ourselves as individuals in this age of Anthropocene, we haven't really, had this moment where we say what is our contribution, but that does not give an excuse to petroleum companies to not, reduce their fossil fuels. So my thoughts are, right, first of all, I think the 10 must-haves framework provides us a fantastic basis to understand what needs to happen. And I think, Peter, I might be your number one shouter on the 10 must-haves in the Global South. I've written about it in our media, I've talked about it. Our media even did an illustration of 10 must-haves in our local kind of culture and perspectives. This is what needs to happen. It has to get out of these rooms, right? It has to be in the global arena. And secondly, what I like about the 10 must-haves is it's clear, right? The language is accessible, just as UNFCCC is now trying to modulate its language. I love your scarf, by the way, and I know it's the temperatures and the global warming. Yeah. And people can understand finally what we're talking about, right? And I think that the key here, especially as we start to delve into the must-dos and the hows, is we've got to keep the language simple and don't go chasing down the rabbit hole of technical jargon. I think this is something that is really important. And if we accept the Petronas president's argument that the key to cracking this issue is just behavioral change, then we need to be in the room with the people that are saying this, and we've got to look at how do we change behaviors. We need to talk to behavioral scientists, different people who may not be in the room when we're discussing climate and so forth. And I think that to crack this nut, we don't only need a report. I think the report is important, but how do we communicate it well? How do we break the market of the TikToks of the world that get this message across? And thirdly, how do we bring young people in? Because we need their energy, we need their ideas, we need their solutions as well. And I think we need to have conversations with people we don't like, the institutions that, are really the ones causing a lot of the problems. And I think that's where perhaps, we can at some point do this. Now, on my part, what I am planning to do is take all this, being in the meeting in New York, bringing it to a planetary health summit in April in Malaysia, and putting 10 must-haves as an agenda item, but also bringing in the private sector, bringing in young people, bringing in communicators, running a workshop for journalists and social media influencers on 10 must-haves, planetary boundaries, planetary health, and then really trying to build a movement. And what we aim to do is to come up with a roadmap on governance. So what you have said has inspired us, and we will use the tools that are already available. How do we connect dots better? And there's so many dots out there. People are confused. Governments are saying we have SDGs, we have Paris agreements, we have UN, you have the Sendai framework. How do we now take another initiative and bring it in? So, in my opinion, planetary health is that binding factor. It really has a systems approach, breaking those silos. Even for me, to influence my health ministry that I advise, to include fossil fuel language into their statement. We love what you're saying, but we have to check what the other ministry feels. So we have to break those silos, and I think planetary health offers that. And we have an opportunity. We are, I think, at a tipping point. And the Summit for the Future in New York next year must be that opportunity we grab together and not fly our own little flags to say we want to champion this, that, and the other. But I think the declaration of the planetary crisis and the components, governance, communications, education revolution in the private sector is what we need to come together on. Academia has a seriously important role to confront the science and bring it there. Communicators need to be able to help us communicate it to the masses. And I think we need to push for education to change. We need to bring the private sector in. And I think, speaking as a trained obstetrician and gynecologist who has delivered more than 15,000 babies, the three words I use most: push, 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 at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemilah. So, in view of the time, what I would like to do is to just follow up with a few short questions for the panelists, and then hand over to Johan for Q&A. Starting with Alex. So, Alex, there was a COP15 in Montreal in December 22. 23 targets. Probably one of the best known is 30 by 30. The question is it enough? What has been done there? Is it fast enough? And who actually will oversee effectiveness of implementation of these targets? Because we have seen with the SDGs, great plans, wonderful targets, but we are actually not moving towards them at the pace that we have to. So what gives you hope that this will be different for biodiversity?
Yeah, no, that's a fundamental question. I think that is fantastic, and I think it really ties to what I said earlier, right? We need to move from evolutionary approaches to revolutionary approaches, right? Again, when Sule set up conservation biology, it was a solutions-based discipline and a crisis-based discipline, and it's been neither one of those things. And uh, is it better now? Okay. So just to say that again, when we created the field, it was a solutions-based discipline and a crisis-based discipline. It's been neither one. We've spent all this time monitoring, right? We've been fighting over what landscapes, hotspots, ecoregions, what terminologies to use. And what we really need to do is think about what are the solutions that actually help us prevent extinction, that prevent biodiversity loss, and that have an evidence-based approach to be able to do it. We actually, in some ways, we don't need more monitoring of charismatic megafauna, right? There's whole groups of inverts that we actually should be looking at. They're the base of the ecosystem. The biggest thing is to actually open up conservation. And conservation, like health in some way, has been a closed field. It has been a field that has been limited in terms of disciplines and approaches and thinking. And we need everyone involved to find it, from the communicators to the design professionals to the engineers to biomedical engineering in particular, to thinking about to the entrepreneurs. We need to create a whole new generation of innovators and entrepreneurs rather than top down, right? We need to actually create the space for the next phase of our economy and the next phase of startups. And this is Chamath, who's a very well-known investor, said the first trillionaire is going to be in climate, right? And that's what we want. We want to make this happen because people are benefiting, the companies are benefiting, everything is aligned, and that is possible to do it without having to do it top down. I think it comes all together.
So are you optimistic in view of the fact that we had really good intentions in other areas and failed? That we have economic opportunities on many fronts and we are not taking them. What makes you optimistic that this one will work?
Because we have a whole new generation of people who will not work for these companies, who will not invest in these companies, who do not want anything to do with these companies, that I think is a disruptive force. And we have a whole new generation of companies that are coming up, right? That are just better.
Coming up in time?
They're coming up fast. I don't know if they're going to be coming up in time, but it's, the Amazon is 5 to 17 years away from tipping, depending on who you ask, but they're coming.
Okay.
They're coming, and I think that there is hope. And I think we have a whole bunch of new tools of, again, involuntary transparency and voluntary transparency that is going to put the spotlights on these places. They can't hide.
Maja, we are seeing actually quite a bit of movements towards nationalistic behavior. Just the opposite of what we would need for addressing effectively the global crisis. we have a system that actually was designed to help us with global governance, United Nations, that you could actually question if it is functioning the way it should. A lot of people would say it's actually failing on many fronts. So, where do you see the optimism on your side that the new approach will actually break through all these barriers? And then let's just think about Kyoto Protocol, which was one attempt on quote unquote global governance of some of the climate action.
Thanks, Peter. Excellent questions. And I would agree with Alex that we're in a new generation of actors, and including companies, entrepreneurs, but also, I think the whole ecosystem around climate and ecological governance has matured since 2015, since the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. And also, I would even distinguish between, for example, the sociological environment when the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. There was still so much power in the misinformation around the science. It was still such a contested, warped kind of space in terms of, and now I think we're in a different era also, even though there's so much scientific education that still has to happen. It's hard. It's very hard to defend sort of a climate denial, et cetera, approach, even though that is happening. But I would also say that, and has to be addressed, I would say also addressed quite directly. And I completely agree with the communications education revolution approach, lifelong education. We're working with some amazing education partners, and also working with different communication strategies on multiple tracks. And speaking to some colleagues here at COP, a lot of the big environmental NGOs are also saying we have to invest in communications. We have to invest in media communications. So I think we have to take that very seriously to address the public mistrust in institutions, address the misinformation. It's not about just climate environment. It's also about other issues that are vital for the functioning of international society. So I think there are a lot of positive trends, but there are these negative polarization trends that have to be also addressed, and more positive actors that are now working together, which I think are very hopeful. And one last point on the, especially international governance, this is happening at the national level too, but they're also subject to non-linear, sort of unpredictable tipping points, social tipping points. And I've seen that time and time again in international processes. Progressive movements, very bold steps forward can happen when you reach a certain tipping point in sort of decision-making processes, actors that you don't necessarily think have a lot of power, but they actually do have power due to their insider knowledge of the system, et cetera. So I think we can really leverage them for big gains in this new enhanced, human ecosystem that we have.
So let's just hope that we actually can muster the positive forces and that they can outdo the inertia and the dragging forces that are still around, and that they're rearing their ugly head here and there in moments that we thought would not come back. Jemilah, if I look at human activities and health, seem to be two ways where we are hurting ourselves. There is the direct behavior that we have in terms of what we eat, how we move, how we don't move, things like that. But then there is that more implicit one. We are, in essence, undermining the life supporting systems, which then also has an effect. So, how are we actually getting out of that, what is almost like a spiral at this point, knowing that there are other ways? How are we actually turning the corner to get more onto the trajectories that we know would be a better one for the future?
I think, Peter, that's a really important question. I'm going to start first by, again, I'm very self-critical of the health sector because it is contributing to emissions. 5% of global emissions are from the health sector. And again, the health sector don't realize this. Yes, it's 10% in the US, 5% globally, 10% in the US. So, when I tell my my health friends about this, what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? And they look at me like, oh yeah, is it about travel? I said, no, it's about what you prescribe. It's about what you do, how you put energy into your hospitals, in your clinics. So there is now a very strong movement that's calling for, and I think very well led by an organization that should be in these conversations, Healthcare Without Harm, that's looking at how you have green hospitals and so on and so forth. I see my friend Maria in the audience now. She's the International Medical Secretary of MSF. Médecins Sans Frontières, as you know, is one of the largest and most successful humanitarian organizations, having a planetary health strategy, because humanitarian response in emergencies also have very high carbon footprints. So I think it's about putting ourselves, turning it around and saying, how do we, first of all, look at ourselves and reduce our health practice emissions? And then secondly, what are we doing with our patients, with our lobbying, with our policies that are going to help us? Now, I'll give you a simple example, right? I'm asthmatic. When I come to Dubai, I'm in trouble because the air quality is so bad. But you can even choose what inhalers you use, because different inhalers have lower uh, carbon footprints, all right, GHG emissions. So doctors don't realize this, right? So it's about simply educating people. And then secondly, in some clinics now, GP practices in Yorkshire and so forth, when you have a mild hypertension, is talking to the person, first of all, about your diet, cutting your meat in your diet, taking more exercise, really talking about this planetary health diet. So we're producing something called Planet Saving Meals as a cookbook that we want to make available worldwide. And if you have recipes from your countries that are plant-based, please send them to me. And we're going to publish this in April as a free resource for everyone globally, digitally. So, making exciting, because great conversations happen around meals. How do you then bring that to the home when you have a plant-based meal at home, and educating children and families about this? So it's about normalizing behaviors that are actually planet friendly, right? So this is one. And I think I want to share that, at our university, planetary health is now a mandatory module. You can't graduate without completing 7 weeks of planetary health, even if you're studying communications or culinary science or engineering or medicine. You learn 3 weeks online, and 4 weeks you apply it to a community, so that we can measure the impact on the community. What engineering solutions do you provide? And I think that, we're going to make the module, once it's ready and stronger, because it's still in pilot phase, be readily available to everyone. So every university can then adapt it to their own context and make this part and parcel of our education. We have to revolutionize education.
That's a great point. And we are still at ASU sort of struggling with which concept can you implement so that every of our 150,000 incoming students gets a sense of which world are they living in, right, before they go on in whatever engineering or anything like that. So Johan, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you could start leading that, that would be great.
Yeah, so floor's open. Yes, please. You can stand here. Yeah, please go ahead. Please stand.
Yeah, hello. My name is Julie Pullen. I'm an earth system scientist and investor in climate tech. And my question is designed to draw out the dimension of security that underlies as foundational to your 10 must haves. It is the fundamental responsibility of government to provide safety and security for their population, despite some examples of abrogation of that responsibility we've seen recently. I would love to get your thoughts about how that connects deeply to your 10 must haves. Thank you.
Thanks. I think perhaps Maya on the Climate Governance Commission security was quite central, and Peter as well. But Maya, would you have any direct? Let's see. We have just one.
Do we have a second mic?
No, no, no.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you the QR code to the report so you can look at what we say about the security dimension, and we have some concrete proposals in the report. And indeed, as you say, you say it so sharply and eloquently about government's responsibility, safety and security of their people, and that's indeed a principle under international law that trumps national sovereignty, in fact. So, but we haven't applied this yet to planetary, Earth system security or environmental security. So we're trying to, push forward, do the norm entrepreneurship necessary to make sure this is, crystal clear. And then also on the ground, as I mentioned, with the alliance, we're going to be building with partners to really talk to the diplomats, the officials who are responsible for international security policy, and to really push the narrative so they're in line with the requirements of the age, basically. So happy to talk further about this after. Did you have
Let's just take more questions so that we get.
We have
pass that over?
Thanks, Felix Dodds, also at ASU. Nice to see you guys. Just on the health thing, we had the same problem with water. I ran with the Stockholm International Water Institute from 2007 to 2012, the Water Coalition. And what we did in Cancun was to get an agreement to have, well, so when they wouldn't accept water people on the government delegation, so we accredited them as NGOs, and that embarrassed them enough to add them into the system. And then we got water agreed in Cancun that would be workshops feeding into the National Adaptation and Mitigation Plan. It's a good way of doing it. The second thing is there's a great opportunity coming up, which is the United Nations Environment Assembly. Next year, all the MEAs are going there. It's the first time that they'll be going there. And if you were to get some text into the outcome which said that the IPCC, the IPBES, and the new Intergovernmental Panel on Pollution, that the executive director should look at overlaps coordination and report to UNEA 7 about how UNEP should coordinate those bodies, that would get you your fourth thing. And the final thing on the MEAs, the French and the Germans did not know what a World Environment Organization would look like, and that's why they didn't win that battle. And the second thing on that is if you finish the clustering that Akam Steiner started on chemicals, and you do the biodiversity one next, then Montreal and climate, by 2030, you would have a WTO of the environment.
Was that a comment or a question?
Yeah, I think that's very much a really useful comment. But any reflections on?
Let's further. Great suggestion.
Yeah. Thanks.
Alan Ware, World Future Council. Just a really quick follow-up on Maya's response to the question of peace and security and the connections with the environment, and the Climate Governance Commission report, and the Mobilizing Earth Governance Alliance platform, which is taking forward the report. I have the flyers on this. Some of those proposals actually relate directly to this. For example, the proposals to make better use of the International Court of Justice for resolving environmental and international other disputes. They match the connection between the environment and the peace and security issues and address the question asked by a colleague here. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Really valuable. Yes, we have a.
Hi, Megan Lubbers. I'm with Nuclear for Climate, and I come from Arizona, which gets half of its energy, carbon-free energy, from the Palo Verde Generating Station. And I was wondering if your organization supports nuclear power as part of the critical role in creating net zero for energy production.
ASU's position on that?
Well, there are probably several positions within that. Personally, I don't think nuclear power will solve the problem. We still have the problem with nuclear waste. There is, of course, next generation nuclear power plants, but you still create nuclear waste, and that is something that I think will be a challenge in scaling it up to the point where we really would need it. But I do know that there are many developments underway, and we are watching that carefully while we are driving primarily, of course, as you know, solar, wind, and other sources.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, Inge Rolf. I'm co-founder of an organization called Global Choices, a foundation, and Johan, we know each other. The question for me and to the panel is about prioritization, because it seems to me, there's no question we're in a crisis. How do we choose the most important thing to save? And for us, it's been the Arctic and the cryosphere, but actually to take and model things, because that's the way transformation happens, is by creating models that people can say, this is how it works, and therefore we can replicate. And so we've actually designed from the get-go a system that incorporates all of this, things like change of governance, changing the lens into a whole system lens for the Arctic, no longer just the province of the northern province of countries. How do we include young people, make it genuinely intergenerational? How do we change the laws? How do we model new laws? How do we bring in economics? It's all part of a whole system of training, and then also training young future leaders. So I think it's, I'd love to hear if you, how do we champion models so that we can easily say, oh yeah, that's how it worked. It set a precedent, shifted the narrative. And I'd be really interested to hear about where you see those things happening. I mean, certainly, and also in terms of law, we had a wonderful panel yesterday about things like what are we not seeing? We're seeing there's a very subtle shift. There's ecocide, rights of nature, all these cases that are happening. And I think, so much of this change is going to happen in a non-traditional way. We're at that wonderful inflection point, and this is where this disruption is going to come from. So thank you.
I see Alex and then Jemilah as well. Alex?
Yeah, just very quickly, one of the things we've been doing is, again, trying to focus on the solution piece, because conservation has really been red lists and ecosystems and which ones are the most important. So we've been inspired by Project Drawdown and how that looked at evidence-based ways of looking at what things could prevent CO2 or draw down CO2 from the atmosphere, and trying to create a drawdown for extinction, what we call the Extinction Solutions Index. So what things could prevent the maximum number of extinctions happening for species, and then how do we then direct funding into those areas from the private sector, from blended capital, from new types of capital we call venture impact, that moves the needle on the things that will protect the most species, because we're on the edge of a sixth mass extinction. We have a good sense of what we're about to lose, but we need solutions that then work at it. So that's one way that we've been trying to do that prioritization.
Jemilah? I think
At a more national and local level, what we've been doing is pushing the government of Malaysia to develop a national planetary health action plan. And they agree, and it's chaired by the Prime Minister. And what it's trying to do, and hopefully be ready by middle of next year, is to really look at a system shifts that needs to happen if we are going to, survive the planetary crisis, and then breaking those silos. So for those interested, we have a session tomorrow. But I think it's about how do you also push, as you said, from the governance level, but also having it led by scientists, but also having a multi-stakeholder engagement. And one of the pillars we actually focus on was actually communications and behavior change, because a lot of times when people design plans and programs, they forget that at the end of the day, you want to have good communications and behavior changes, not just at people level, but also government.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, so we are typically talking, when we are talking about prioritization, about subsystems, the Arctic, biodiversity, health, etc. What we really have to get to, and the 10 must-haves are, of course, the need that fundamentally is an Earth system model that brings all these components together, and where, in essence, as it is complexity, where you look at the behavior of that model, where are actually, with the pressures that we're imposing on it, where's the vibration going to the point where it's leading to resonances? And then you have to prevent these resonances to lead to systematic failure. And there is progress in that. There's quite a bit on the digital twin front. I think we have to push that type of modeling much faster than we have done in the past. And we have to take our cues from that, because otherwise we will compartmentalize and do our prioritization within these compartments. And that might actually lead to the point where we are missing some of the major crises that are heading towards us. So I think it's really holistic view, Earth system model with social component, knowing it's difficult. We thought that climate modeling is impossible in the early 80s. We got a long ways. I think we simply have to do it, and we have to put the right resources behind it.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks to the panel. I think we're coming, we are over time actually. So just to round this off with a few reflections from my side as well, and the next step for this whole must-have initiative, and one connection just to your point, Ingeborg, here, that we've in the must-have initiative taken a very comprehensive whole Earth system approach for humanity's dignified, prosperous, equitable future on planet Earth. So of course it's an enormous agenda. But I think just what comes out of this panel is, well, that we have some really interesting levers that we can pull very rapidly in a transformative fashion. And personally, I would actually be very much with Alex here that, we're in the sixth mass extinction of species. We're losing the living biosphere so fast that even in the uncertainty and complexity of science, there's actually zero uncertainty in terms of the need to move really fast on, for example, zero expansion of agriculture, complete conservation of the remaining few carbon sinks in intact nature on planet Earth. That's kind of in the space of no-brainers, and that we can push very hard. And if you do that in the Arctic or in the Amazon or in the temperate forests up in the boreal zone, these will automatically connect with all the other agenda points, because you cannot save the Arctic without having a decarbonization pathway. So it's quite interesting how the interconnectedness, which makes us very worried, is actually one of our opportunities, because you pull in one end and everything else will follow inevitably. So that's I think one part here. The must-have initiative has gone through two cycles, through the leadership of the Arizona State University and the New York Climate Week with the Global Futures conferences. They've been remarkably successful events with very, very dynamic interactions. I hope ASU will continue with that, and we're doing that under the auspices of the Earth League. Very strong, broad community of science-driven dialogues. So this is we're having this dialogue today in the midst of this process, and we're looking forward to continue to get your inputs and to share experiences along this way. I'd also like to take home what I will carry with me as the most important message from this dialogue, which is that when someone with 15,000 births as experience tells us push at the right time, well, dear friends, the right time is now. So I think that is really good at scientifically based advice or empirically based advice. Alex, Jemilah, Maja, Peter, thanks a lot to the panel, and thanks for this dialogue.